start with some of the key takeaways from NATO's communique. Do you feel like the priorities have shifted more towards Beijing now?
Yeah, definitely. That was evident in the communique itself. There were about 10 references to China this time around. You compare that to a few years ago where it was just, one sentence on China. So clearly there is a higher focus on Beijing and the threat it poses to, Western values as was articulated in that communique. There is some disagreement on how far NATO should go to counter China. Russia remains the big focus of the alliance. It was mentioned 60 times by comparison, more than 6 times that of China. But the fact that China is playing so prevalent a role, shows the fundamental shift going on. Led by the U.S., particularly Biden's attempts to get this more on the agenda and get allies on the same page regarding China, both at the G7 and at the NATO summit.
And John, we have had a response now from the Chinese mission in Belgium saying that and urging NATO to view China's development rationally, to stop exaggerating various forms of the China threat theory. Just broadly, how do you expect China to respond in the short to medium term to this kind of more concerted push from NATO?
I think in the short term this afternoon we will get a pretty boisterous response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry when they do their daily briefing. I think in the medium term you'll see Beijing trying to calculate a response that, again, to what the NATO allies said, where can we collaborate and where do we have to be competitive and where is there a rivalry? I think there's been a lot of suspicion in Beijing looking at NATO, looking at the G7 as sort of a bloc forming to sort of take actions against China. And the stronger the rhetoric out of Europe, out of the U.S., I think the more that suspicion grows here in Beijing.
And Dan, following up what John just said, even among the G7 and NATO nations, there is seemingly a bit of rift in terms of what it means to both compete and cooperate with China as well. Where do you see the most divisions?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we saw that in the, call for a new investigation into the origins of the coronavirus, for example. The lab leak theory particularly, has gained a lot of steam in the U.S. with Biden calling on the intelligence agencies to continue probing it. There was a lot of skepticism in Europe on how far to go on that. A lot of diplomats telling reporters that they weren't convinced of the evidence of that theory and not sure it was worth going to bat for. We've just seen that in the optics in particular. I mean, Europe is keen to emphasize that they want to balance ties with China. It was only 6 months ago they were reaching a landmark investment deal, with China. So the EU is keen to get that back on track. Merkel in particular noting that the U.S. and U.K. weren't exporting vaccines for a while. So, there are internal tensions where European leaders don't want to totally jump in bed with the U.S. here when it comes to issues on China and want to maintain that kind of more balanced relationship.
And John, do you think, given what Dan was just outlining there in terms of the modest pushback from Merkel and Macron in terms of how hard you want to go on China, will Beijing take any comfort from that? And will they try to exploit some of those divisions that we're seeing, whether it's the G7 or NATO?
I think we're starting to see sort of a two-track approach. I mean, even with the U.S., we saw Vice Premier Liu He having chats with Yellen and Catherine Tai, also the commerce ministers from both countries speaking last week. But at the same time, you also see this sort of continued tension between the two countries with the NATO allies over things like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan. I think we're going to see that continue. You're going to see areas of intense competition and then other places, climate change being another, where there are going to be steps towards collaboration.